Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm just here to do my second book review for this channel, so I'm just going to get straight into it. So today I'm going to be reviewing a book called Serendipities, Language and Lunacy. It was written by Umberto Eco. Now, doing some background reading for this review and looking into Umberto Eco, I found out that he actually passed away 2 years ago, so rest in peace to Umberto Eco. And he seemed like he was a very, very intelligent individual, a great scholar, very well read. Historian, a theologian, a linguist, and also a philosopher. So as you can see, his range of topics are quite broad, and he appears to have covered a lot of ground. This is the first book of his that I read, and I look forward to picking up more if I do come across them in the future. I was quite surprised that I hadn't come across his books prior to this, as not that I'm some sort of fountain of knowledge or anything, or that I'm this this source for all references and all books. But when you read into similar themes and similar backgrounds and similar topics, you generally come across similar names. And as they say, you know, all roads lead to Rome. All paths lead to Rome. So I was a bit surprised that I hadn't heard about him until now, but nonetheless, I came across him, and I'm really glad that I did, actually, because his book was quite good. The first thing I want to start off with is somewhat of a criticism and a comment on the book's structure. Now, the book is a collection of essays, so it's about 5 or 6 essays that have been put together and then bound by the book cover and then sold to the public, as you can see here. So this essay type structure of this book, it has some advantages, it has some disadvantages, okay? The main advantages to having an essay type book or essay structured book is that each essay stands alone. You can pick up the essay and you can read it without having read the prior essays. You don't have to read the essays which come after it either to understand the essay. You can begin from the start and then go to the end like a regular book, or you can begin from the middle, go to the end, start from the back, go to the front. It doesn't really matter. It's all up to preference. You can pick up one essay and then leave the book as it is, and then go about your day, go about your business without having to keep necessarily reading to understand what's going on, or to get necessarily the author's message across. In most cases, the message is portrayed in the single essay. Also, if you want to then go back and reference these essays, if you want to link them to friends, you can then do so. The people that you are giving these essays to, they don't necessarily have to read the whole book to understand what you're talking about. And also, sometimes these essays are written years apart. So perhaps one essay was written in 2001, the next one was written in 2009. And unless an individual makes an effort to bring these essays together, it can be difficult tracking them down individually and finding the common thread between all of them. So I'm not saying that this is a bad thing that the essay is structured as a book. I'm just saying that it has some sort of advantages. The disadvantage is that really that it lacks the overall unity of a book. The reason why I enjoy books themselves is because you have this plot developing and you can follow the author's line of thoughts and the story, and it progresses, and then the more you read, the more things unfold. You don't necessarily get this with the essay type structured book. Sorry about that. You don't necessarily get it with the essay type structured book. What you get is individual, I suppose, pieces of information which you can then put together to then overall create a story for yourself in a certain way, or you can extract the general kind of theme in each essay and then extrapolate from then on. So getting straight into the book now. The book is called Serendipities, Language and Lunacy, and when I first read the title cover, I was a bit confused as to what was really happening in the book, because the description is quite vague. You know, the title is quite vague. It's difficult to interpret what the book would actually be about just simply reading the front cover. However, as soon as you start reading a few pages, get 20 pages in, you can slowly start to unravel what the actual title cover and what the book description really is, and you can see where the serendipities come in, you can see where the language comes in, and then the final aspects of the lunacy. Now, so serendipity is an unintended consequence. And prior to reading this book, I was familiar with serendipity, however, I hadn't really thought too much about it. I hadn't really dipped into those themes. However, you know, coming through, reading this book, I can definitely say that I'll be thinking about the idea of the concept of a serendipity and how serendipity relates to our lives, much more thoroughly and much more consistently. I'll be thinking about these things. Now, serendipity is something in which, like I said, is an unintended consequence. However, for example, we generally in our human naivety tend to assume that a good intention generally leads to a good outcome. Or at least I do, you know, at least me in my innocence and my naivety, tend to assume that, you know, a good, intention leads to a good outcome. And then a bad intention generally leads to a bad outcome also. And also, obviously, it's relative and depend on who you ask and, which side of the coin you're on. However, generally, I think we know, as human beings, as people, we tend to believe that a good intention would generally lead to a good outcome. However, what Umberto Eco really clearly demonstrates in this book is that this isn't the case. Good intentions can lead to bad outcomes, and really just bad intentions can have great, significant outcomes. And some of these outcomes aren't necessarily instant, and they aren't necessarily short term. Some of them are long term. Some take quite a long time to unravel and unfold. And although this is somewhat of a truism, because causality is a real thing, you know, cause and effect is a real thing. So of course certain events are going to have repercussions, both good and bad. But what Eco demonstrates in this book is that some of these historical examples have had quite I guess groundbreaking outcomes. For example, in the first essay, he talks about the Rosicrucians, this conspiracy theory, and how the Rosicrucians was essentially a parody and a bluff created by unknown individuals who then propagated this idea of a secret society and a highly intelligent, I suppose, covenant of intellectuals which were guarding truth and guarding knowledge, and how people in the medieval times and in France believed this theory and believed this story, and then disseminated this misinformation. This misinformation was then taken up by other so-called secret societies, the Masons, and then it's culminated in what we have today is the Illuminati, which is quite a parody in and of itself as well, and how the Illuminati links the Masons to the Knights Templar to the Rosicrucians and whatnot. However, if you really dig deep into history, you realize that all of these proponents of these conspiracy theories don't really exist. The conspiracy theories themselves, their origins are baseless in many cases, and they're created in terms of a parody. So this is a misinterpretation of language. This is a misinterpretation of information, either purposefully misinterpreted or accidentally misinterpreted. And this has then led to a serendipity, which is an unintended consequence. And this is where the serendipity side comes in. The lunacy aspect of the book is shown how is highlighted when individuals, I guess, fall into madness or insane kind of ways of thinking, and seeing significance in events which are not significant, seeing truth in baseless facts, not even facts, I suppose, baseless information. So this is where the lunacy comes in, and how individuals tend to fall into their own biases. And what Eco likes to say in this book is that people will approach the future and they'll read the future carrying and using the books that they've read in the past. And this is quite an obvious, I think, comment, because everybody's going to have some sort of a starting point and some sort of a preconception, some sort of a idea of what they're going to get from a certain event or a certain book or a certain occurrence. Everyone has an expectation, is what I'm trying to say. So this is natural. However, what Eco was saying is that there's a more of a natural kind of expectation, and there's this kind of forced confirmation of a pre-existing bias, and it's extracting and seeking what you want to find in a piece of information, a piece of text, rather than what's really in there, or what the original idea really is. So that leads into the second essay and the third essays, which the second essay was definitely my favorite, and it talks about the search for the original Adamic language and how scholars throughout history have all come to different conclusions as to what the original Adamic language was. And how all of them in some ways were incorrect, and how all of them came to their conclusions based on serendipity, based on the misinterpretation of texts and languages. This was definitely my favorite essay because right now I'm just really thinking about some of these biblical stories and how they relate to contemporary society and man in his current state. So I really found this really intriguing, and opened my mind up a little bit, and it made me ponder upon the original onto what man's original language was. And even if you don't subscribe to the original biblical stories, right, I still think you can find a lot of meaning and a lot of interest in this essay, solely because the question of man's original language is also evolutionarily rooted. So even proponents of evolution, biologists, I myself believe in evolution. I'm not saying I don't. They themselves have also been searching for the original language and the conception and the inception of language, the starting point of language. So even if you don't subscribe to the biblical stories and you want to be somewhat of a snob and closed-minded when it comes to this essay, I still think you can find something of interest and something to feed your minds in this essay. You don't have to think about it in terms of Adam and Eve. You can think about it in terms of the advent of the first Homo sapien and what language he or she spoken. It doesn't necessarily have to be Adam. With that being said, I think the question is extremely intriguing, and it would definitely help to have some sort of a background idea of the stories in Genesis, and the stories of Adam and Eve, and how man was given the ability to name the animals, and what he actually named the animals. Which name did he give them? Which language did he give them? Did he give them a name in Hebrew or Egyptian or even Chinese? Or was Adam given the original man, the first man, was Adam given I suppose a structure for then a structure or I guess an ability to then create language? So something which is more akin to Chomsky's famous idea in linguistics, and how men and human beings have this physiologically rooted foundation to then create language out of, or they can then use this foundation to then create languages, this underlying structure within all of us. So whether God himself gave Adam this underlying potential for language, or whether he designated Adam with a specific language, is really unknown, and it's contested in this book. The serendipity side arises when scholars in history all came to different conclusions using, I suppose they used different sources, but they all still had access to the biblical stories, and how they confirmed their own biases. They fell into lunacy based on misinterpretations of texts and language. Moving forwards into I'm not going to talk about every essay, but the third essay that I really wanted to touch briefly on is how, it relates to Leibniz, the mathematician who was one of the, who was a founder or creator of calculus, alongside Newton. I suppose they came to calculus independently, from what I believe. I'm not 100% sure though, but I believe they weren't really in contact with each other, or they arose independently. But nonetheless, this essay touches on Leibniz, and how Leibniz's theory of calculus was given weight, and was given, and how Leibniz was given confidence to push his ideas of calculus based on a misinterpretation of a Chinese text and a Chinese mathematics. So Leibniz was given the confidence to then propel his theories of calculus and push them on the world, because he accidentally misinterpreted a Chinese text and he didn't know how to read it. What he found in the Chinese text was the support of his ideas of calculus, and also a similarity to his mathematical ideas. So this he thought was a revelation. This he thought was somewhat of a, I guess, not a revelation, but something of great significance to his texts and his work. So he was given the confidence, and then he pushed calculus further with his theory. Pushed the calculus theory further. So what Eco, I think, is trying to say here is that without these serendipitous events, would history be as we currently know it? Would society be shaped as we currently know it? If Leibniz did not misinterpret this Chinese text based on serendipity, would we be using calculus today? Would we have the technology we have today, which are based on these mathematical hypotheses and theorems? And that is, to me, something extremely, extremely, extremely fun and interesting to consider, and I suppose nourishing mentally to consider, because it's so true. It's quite obvious once he points it out that history doesn't progress in this linear, logical, rational fashion. Instead, history, the history of man and the progression of civilization, society, culture, knowledge, is a madhouse and a massive confusion, a massive mess in some instances, in which truth arises and then falsity arises, and truth is misinterpreted and falsity is misinterpreted, and then which leads to another event and so on and so forth ad nauseum until we get to where we get today. And in some cases, lies and misinformation have been beneficial to the development of humanity. And so here I can just say one thing. It reminds me of Thomas Kuhn's ideas of incommensurability, the progression of science, and how he proposed that science doesn't progress, knowledge doesn't really progress in this linear fashion. Science doesn't progress in this linear fashion. Instead, science progresses through these paradigm shifts. And even the relationship between truth and I suppose the status of science isn't necessarily clear cut. It's not a one-to-one relationship. In fact, sometimes you have high amounts of wrong information, large amounts of wrong information, wrong hypotheses, which then lead to real developments in science. Now, that is really what I've been extracting and getting from this book. It's how man falls into his own biases, how man searches for meaning in places where it may not be found, how even misinterpretations can lead to positive outcomes, and how ultimately serendipities have shaped human civilization. And I think if that's not amazing, this idea of serendipity, I don't really know what else I have to say. I found it quite interesting, very, very thought-provoking, very interesting to read. It's not a difficult read by any stretch of the imagination. I think it would definitely help to have some interest, at least in language, some interest in theology or religion, some background knowledge in the stories of Adam and Eve, and at least have some thread of interest in language. I think this would be very, very helpful for this book. If you don't have this, I'm not saying you can't read the book. All I'm saying is that it may be a little bit more interesting to you, maybe a little bit easier to decipher and understand if you've had this, you have this background knowledge. Short, very short book, about 150 pages long. I think the editors and the publishers really stretched this into a book because it is a collection of essays. The print is large. The line spacing is large. You probably could compact it to about 120 pages. So it is a bit of a stretch to call it a book. However, nonetheless, here we are today reviewing it. Umberto Eco, great author. I hope to read more of his books. This book sometimes does get a little bit, not confused, but unnecessary with some of the referencing that he uses. I understand that he's an academic, so when he wrote the essays, I'm sure this is relevant. So that's one of my only criticisms of this book. His language is easy to understand, easy to follow, easy to read. He's a linguist, so hopefully he's good with language. You would assume he would be. With that being said, hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully encourage you to pick up reading and pick up this book and dive into thinking on religion, dive into language, dive into history a little bit, and expand your mind a little bit. Expand your mind and start thinking about how serendipities relate to your life and how serendipities have shaped human civilization. Because I know that this has caused me to think in a slightly different way for sure. It has given me some sort of a starting point for serendipities. Thanks guys. Thanks for listening and have a good day. Yeah. Take care.